In this video, we will be investigating graph transformations. How can we plot a graph quickly knowing some basic things? So as you see on the screen, you have a function. We're going to call that f. So I'm going to click on this one and say, well, what happens when I add 2 to that function? What kind of graph do I get? Seems like this dot moved up 2 units. This moved up 2 units. Everything moved up 2. Well, what if I have a minus 3? It moved down. 1, 2, 3. It moved down. 1, 2, 3. Well, what happens when the plus is inside the parentheses as opposed on the outside? Does that do something different? Well, let's see. It moved it to the left. So look at this point here, right there, and we look at that point all the way over, and we've moved over 4 units. What happens if we have a minus 5 inside the parentheses? Well, hopefully you're predicting it's going to move to the right. So this dot right here moved over all the way over here. This was at 0. This is at 5. Everything moved to the right. What happens if we have a negative in front? What did we do when we had parabolas and absolute values? Remember how we talked about it flipping it upside down? It does, but it really multiplies the y values times negative 1. So you look at this positive 2 here, it becomes a negative 2. Everything that was at 0 multiplied by anything is still 0. So these points became up, these blue became down. Well, what if I changed instead of negative 1, what if I had a 2? What happens? It becomes twice as tall. Everything's multiplied by 2. What if I had a half? I'm going to type it in as a decimal, 0.5. It makes it half as tall. So those are the transformations we're going to be looking at. So let's take some notes. What do those numbers do to the graph? When we add a constant on the outside of the parentheses, it moves the graph up. If we subtract a constant, which is just a number, it moves the graph down. But when the constant is added inside the parenthesis, we saw it didn't move it to the right like you might expect with the plus. It actually moved it to the left. And then when we subtracted, that moved it to the right. When we had a negative in front, yes, we talk about it flipping it across the y-axis, but I want you to think about that it really multiplies the y values by negative 1. Multiplying. So what if we multiplied by a different constant besides negative 1? Then it's just going to multiply, again, the y values by whatever that constant is. So if it's a 2, it multiply it by 2 and so forth. So in general, when we have a being multiplied, it affects the y values. When we have a constant on the outside of that parenthesis, it affected the y values because it moved it up and down. But when you have something inside the parentheses, that's going to make it a side-to-side shift, and it affects the x values. I know it sounds complicated, but it really is very easy. So the given graphs are in blue. That's our f of x. We're going to create a new graph by the transformations. As in, what does that minus 2 do to the graph? It moves it down 2 units. So what you want to do is just take some representative points from the original graph, enough where when you play connect the dots you get that same shape, and just shift all those dots or points down 2. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and then reconnect those points in the same shape. Of course, mine's not perfect, but good enough. So it should be exactly the same shape if I could graph it perfectly, just shifted down 2 units. Well, what happens when the minus 2 is inside the parenthesis? Look at your notes. It is shifted to the right 2 units. So again, I'm just going to take some representative points and shift all of those to the right 2 units and play connect the dots. Keep the shape exactly the same. Right, so now we have where we have a negative multiplied on the outside. What does that do? It multiplies all the y values times -1. So again, I'm going to pick some points, but I need to know what the y values are. Well, here y is equal to 0. This is 4. That's 0. Here y is equal to -2. So if I multiply all of those times -1, what happens? Well, if I multiply 0 times -1, those all stay the same. But if I multiply 4 times -1, I get -4. So it's going to go down. If I multiply -2 times -1, I get +2, so it's going to go up. So I get that reflection across the y-axis. Now, problem number 4 puts problems 1, 2, and 3 all together on one graph. Does it make a difference what transformation I do first? Yes, it does. This right here is multiplication. We are multiplying, where this and this, of course, is subtraction. In our order of operations, we need to multiply first. So always do this first. Now, since problem number 3 was g of x equals negative f of x, I'm going to use the answer to number 3 and move that graph. Okay, so let me be clear. I'm taking this graph right here as step 1, and then what am I going to do to that graph? I am going to move it. What did we do? We went down 2, and we also went to the right 2. Okay. You could do it, you know what? It might be easier if I do that graph on top of this one. So if I take this one and I go down 2 and to the right 2. This point, down 2 and the right 2. And tell you, and just to say, you could go right and then down. That order doesn't matter because they're both subtraction. All right, so let's see. We've got this graph, down 2 and right 2. So now we have this part. Then we have, let's see, down 2, right 2. This dot, down 2, right 2. Now, if that looks a little confusing, I think it does. Let me go back to what was my negative f of x look like. So that was my negative f of x, and then what I proceeded to do is do the other shifts. So I'm going to do it again, but I'm going to do it in the other order. I'm going to go right 2 and down 2, right 2 and down 2, and again, I'm getting that same graph, but I did this in a different order. So let's look a little bit more complicated. All right, so we don't have just a -1 in front, we have a half. So that means I need to multiply the y values times 1/2. Again, we're going to multiply the y values by 1/2. So if you remember, what were those y values? Well, those were all 0, so that stays 0. But this y value is 4. What's half of 4? It's 2. So the graph is going to be half as tall. This y value is -2. Half of that is -1. And of course, we're back to 0. So hopefully you can see the graph is kind of getting closer and closer to the x-axis because we multiplied those y values by a number smaller than 1. So what happens when we multiply something by 2? What's going to happen? Well, we're going to multiply those y values by 2. So again, our 0 times 2 stays 0. If this is 4 times 2 is 8, I'm going to squeeze it up here. So it's going to go way tall and come back down. This, of course, was negative 2 times 2 is negative 4. So way down here and then back to 0. So it makes it twice as tall. Now, on number 7, we're going to do some new things. Well, we're going to put it all together. So look at this. We're multiplying by negative 1/2. We got an addition of 1 there and an addition of 2 there. What all does that mean to do? Well, first of all, I have to multiply the y values by negative 1/2. I've got to do that first, multiplication first. So I'm going to do that graph. Okay, so my zeros stay the same. This is 4. Negative half of 4 will be negative 2. Then this y value is negative 2. Negative half of that is positive 1. So that's that graph. So that graph is in red. Now, what am I going to do with the red graph? I'm going to move it up 2 because of that, and I'm going to move it left 1 because of that. I'm going to take the red graph and I'm going to take up 2 and left 1. Up 2, left 1, up 2, left 1. So all of a sudden I've got that part of the graph. Let's see, where was I? Right here. So I've got to go up 2 and left 1. Got to go here, up 2 and left 1. So I would encourage you to use different colors. I would also encourage you to have the notes printed out or the homework printed out so you can use the grids that are given. So just to review, when you're adding a constant on the outside of the parenthesis, you go up, but on the inside, you go left. If you subtract a constant, you go down. If it's inside those parentheses, you go right. And anything on the outside of that where you're multiplying, you have to do that transformation first.